Hello. Welcome to my YouTube channel, True Fear and Fiction. Step into the shadows and explore the chilling world of horror. Before watching, please like and subscribe to support me in producing more stories. This helps spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. I was lying in bed, the dim light from the street lamp filtering through my curtains, casting eerie shadows across my room when I first felt it. That unmistakable weight pressing down on my chest, a heavy force that seemed to pin me to my mattress. And in that moment, I realized I was trapped, unable to move or even blink. My body unresponsive as a thick blanket of dread began to settle over me like a shroud. The air felt dense, charged with an energy that buzzed just below the surface of my skin, prickling and electrifying, making my heart race as I struggled against the invisible bonds that held me down. Panic rising in my throat like bile, choking off my breath as I fought to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. Only a suffocating silence enveloping me. The kind of silence that can make your skin crawl, and I could feel the shadows dancing at the edges of my vision, dark figures lurking just beyond my ability to perceive them fully, shapes that twisted and contorted as if they were alive, almost beckoning me to succumb to the terror that gripped my heart. And in that moment of helplessness, I thought of all those nights I had brushed aside the stories of sleep paralysis as mere figments of imagination, the stuff of urban legends and whispered tales, never believing that one day I would find myself at the mercy of an unseen force, lying here, vulnerable and terrified, trapped in a realm where reality blurred with nightmare. As the oppressive weight settled heavier, I felt a chill creep into the room, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones, as if the air itself had transformed into something sinister and cold. And I became acutely aware of the sound of my own heartbeat, thumping violently in my chest, a primal rhythm that seemed to echo off the walls like a warning bell. Each thud a reminder of my mortality, and then, as if summoned by my fear, I felt it. The unmistakable presence of something dark lurking just beyond my peripheral vision, a shadow that shifted and moved with a purpose, and despite my inability to turn my head, I could sense it drawing closer, a malevolence that seeped into the very fibers of my being, urging me to succumb to despair, and with every inch it drew nearer, I felt a wave of nausea rise within me, the sensation so profound that I could taste it, bitter and acrid, threatening to drown me in a sea of dread. It was then that I heard it, a low whisper that seemed to reverberate through the air, a sound so close yet so far, slithering into my ears and curling around my thoughts like a serpent, the words indistinguishable but charged with an ominous intent that sent shivers racing down my spine. And I found myself straining against the paralysis, willing my limbs to move, to fight against the invisible force that sought to keep me subdued. But every attempt was met with resistance, a cruel reminder that I was trapped in this nightmare, my body betraying me, and I could feel the sweat pooling at the base of my neck, a tangible manifestation of my terror, trickling down my spine like icy fingers. And all I could do was breathe, shallow and panicked, praying that this would end, that I would awaken and find myself safe in my bed. But deep down, I feared the truth, that this was my reality, that I was helpless against whatever dark thing had taken residence in my room. The shadows grew thicker, almost sentient in their malevolence, swirling around me like a storm, and I could almost make out the features of the entity lurking within, a grotesque visage that shifted and morphed in the darkness, eyes glimmering like distant stars, predatory and hungry. And as I stared into that abyss, I felt the very essence of despair wrapping itself around my heart, squeezing tighter with each passing second. And I wanted to look away, to shut my eyes and pretend it wasn't there. But the paralyzing fear kept my gaze locked. And in that moment, I could almost hear the creature's breath, a ragged sound that resonated within my bones, sending tremors of dread coursing through my veins. And I felt a whisper of thought that maybe this was it, that I was destined to be swallowed whole by this darkness, to become yet another tale of caution whispered among the living, a warning against the dangers of sleeping alone. And then, as if sensing my despair, the entity moved closer, a shadow coiling around my form, and I felt a rush of cold air against my skin, as though it were testing the waters, gauging my fear like a predator honing in on its prey. And with that movement, my mind raced, grappling with the remnants of rational thought as I recalled the stories, the warnings about the creatures that fed on fear, the ones that thrived in the darkness, and I desperately clung to the hope that this was just a dream, a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I could feel the weight of its presence, tangible and malevolent, pressing down on me like a funeral pall. And in my heart, I began to accept the terrible truth that perhaps this was no mere dream, that I was in the clutches of something far more sinister, something that would not let me go. With every breath I took, the air grew heavier, laden with a darkness that threatened to smother me, and I felt the familiar tug of panic surge within me, clawing at my insides like a wild animal seeking to escape its cage, and I fought harder against the paralysis, summoning every ounce of willpower I had left, willing my fingers to twitch, to claw at the sheets, to do anything that might signal to the world outside that I was here, alive and terrified. And just when I thought I might break through the veil of horror that held me captive, I felt a chilling caress against my cheek, a touch so cold it sent shockwaves through my body, and a new wave of dread washed over me. For in that moment, I understood that I was not alone, that the shadows had teeth, and they were closing in. I could feel it hovering just above me, breathing my air, the whispering voice growing louder, more insistent, wrapping around my thoughts and squeezing them until all I could do was focus on that sound, an unholy mixture of hissing and laughter, the kind that claws at the edges of sanity and draws you into a pit of despair. And as I lay there, suffocating under the weight of it all, a thought flickered in the back of my mind, a desperate plea for survival. What if I could fight back? What if I could push against this darkness with every ounce of strength I had? And so I concentrated, visualizing myself breaking free from the binds of this nightmare, willing my eyelids to flutter, to open, to confront the terror head-on. And as if sensing my resolve, the darkness shrieked, a sound that cut through the night like glass shattering. And I felt the grip on my chest loosen, just enough for me to gasp a breath of sweet, precious air. In that fleeting moment of clarity, I focused all my energy on moving, on rolling over, on sitting up, and with a surge of adrenaline, I felt my body respond, the paralysis shattering like a fragile illusion. And with a frantic motion, I flipped onto my side, gasping for breath as I pulled myself upright, my heart pounding furiously in my chest, and I blinked against the darkness, my eyes wide, searching for any trace of the entity that had held me captive. But the room was empty, the shadows retreating back into the corners as if they had never been there at all. And I could still hear the echo of that whisper lingering in the air, a haunting reminder that they were close, always close. And though I had escaped its grasp, I knew this wasn't over. The darkness still lingered, a shadowy presence waiting for the right moment to strike again. And as I sat there, heart racing and skin prickling with residual fear, I couldn't shake the feeling that the night was far from over, that I would once again find myself lying in bed, trapped in that paralyzing embrace of shadow, forever haunted by the memory of what had nearly consumed me whole. But I was not ready to surrender, not now, not after feeling the ice-cold fingers of dread brush against my skin. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet touching the cool floor, grounding me in the reality that this was my room, my sanctuary, and I had to reclaim it. I took a deep breath, focusing on the reassuring sounds of the world outside. The distant hum of a passing car, the soft rustle of leaves against my window. Anything to remind me that I was still here, that I was still alive. I forced myself to stand, swaying slightly as I adjusted to the sudden flood of adrenaline coursing through my veins. The walls felt like they were closing in, shadows clinging to the corners, whispering dark promises that threatened to ensnare me once more, but I refused to look away. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, its soft glow illuminating the darkness, casting a feeble barrier against the encroaching shadows, and I began to pace, each step echoing loudly in the silence, my breath quickening as I searched for the logic that had escaped me during my paralysis. Maybe it was just a dream, I muttered to myself. hoping the words would ring true. But the fear still gnawed at the edges of my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike, like a spider in its web. The air around me felt electric, charged with a tension that made my skin crawl, and I started to question every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains in the slight breeze, wondering if they were signs of the malevolent presence that had nearly consumed me. In a desperate bid to reclaim control, I opened the window, allowing the night air to flood in, crisp and invigorating, pushing back the stale fear that clung to the room. The sounds of the night surrounded me, crickets chirping, a distant dog barking, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a semblance of peace return, a reminder that life continued beyond the confines of my own terror. I leaned against the windowsill, breathing deeply, and tried to gather my thoughts. But as I looked out into the inky blackness, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was lurking just beyond the light, hidden in the shadows, waiting for me to let my guard down. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the hallway, the sound sharp and jarring, cutting through my moment of calm like a knife. My heart leapt into my throat, and I felt that familiar clenching in my stomach, the dread rising like bile. I turned toward the door, every instinct screaming for me to retreat, to hide, but there was a part of me that craved answers, that needed to confront the source of my fear head-on. I took a step forward, my feet moving almost involuntarily, drawn by an unseen force that pushed me toward the unknown. As I reached the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering above the knob, the chill of the metal sending shivers up my arm. I could hear nothing now, only the deafening silence that enveloped me, thick and suffocating, and I wondered if whatever had invaded my dreams was now watching me from the other side. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, steeling myself, and turned the knob with a firm grip. The door creaked open, and I was met with darkness, the dim light from my room failing to penetrate the shadows that clung to the hallway. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling, unsure if I truly wanted an answer. The sound seemed to reverberate off the walls, swallowed by the heavy silence that enveloped me, and I took a tentative step forward, my heart pounding wildly against my ribs. The hallway stretched out before me, a seemingly endless tunnel of darkness, the walls lined with framed pictures of happier times. But even they felt distorted in the low light, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of fear. As I moved deeper into the hallway, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread coiling around me like a serpent, constricting tighter with each step. I reached for the light switch, but my hand hesitated, hovering above it as I recalled the shadows that had danced in my room, how they had whispered and clawed at my sanity. "Just flip the switch," I urged myself, trying to ignore the icy tendrils of fear wrapping around my mind. Finally, I flicked the switch, flooding the hallway with harsh light, and for a moment, I felt a rush of triumph, believing I had banished the darkness. But as the light poured in, I was met with the stark realization that I was not alone. A shadow shifted at the far end of the hall, a dark figure that seemed to writhe and pulse with malevolence, and I froze, the world around me narrowing to that single point of darkness. I wanted to run, to retreat back to the safety of my room, but my feet felt glued to the floor, and the very air around me seemed to thrum with tension. The figure began to move toward me, gliding across the floor with an unnatural grace, its edges blurring and shifting as if it were made of smoke and shadow. The whispers returned, now louder and more insistent, wrapping around me like a vice, urging me to succumb, to surrender to the fear that flooded my veins. "Get away from me," I shouted, my voice cracking, filled with desperation, but the entity continued its approach, the air growing colder, thick with an oppressive energy that felt as if it was sucking the warmth from the room. I felt an overwhelming urge to flee, to escape the confines of my home and run into the night, but my body remained paralyzed, caught in the grip of something far beyond my comprehension. Suddenly, the lights flickered, plunging the hallway into darkness, and I felt a rush of cold air, a gust that sent shivers down my spine. The whispers became a cacophony of sound, an unholy chorus that invaded my thoughts, drowning out my screams as I fought to break free from the terror enveloping me. I turned to run back to my room, the light behind me flickering weakly as I stumbled forward, but I could feel the darkness creeping in, wrapping around me like a shroud. And the shadow was no longer just behind me. It was everywhere, inescapable and hungry. Just when I thought I might be lost to it forever, a burst of clarity surged through me. I remembered the moments when I had felt this fear before, how I had fought against it and escaped. With every ounce of strength I had left, I forced my feet to move, running with all my might, my heart pounding in rhythm with my desperate breaths, the whispers growing fainter as I neared my room. I reached the door, slamming it shut behind me and locking it tight, my hands trembling as I leaned against it, gasping for breath. For a moment, the silence was deafening, and I felt a fragile sense of safety wrap around me, a thin barrier against the darkness that had almost consumed me. I stumbled back to my bed, collapsing onto it as the adrenaline coursed through me, shaking and shivering as I tried to process what had just happened. But even as I lay there, panting, I could feel the shadows lingering just outside my door, their whispers clawing at the edges of my mind, a reminder that they were waiting for the next moment of weakness, the next chance to break through and claim me as their own. As the hours dragged on, I lay wide awake, heart racing, listening to the soft sounds of the night, every creak of the house making me jump, every rustle of fabric sending my mind spiraling back to that terrible encounter. I knew I couldn't let myself fall asleep again. Not with that entity lurking just beyond the veil of consciousness, but fatigue began to claw at me, an insistent pull that threatened to drag me under. Just as I began to slip into the haze of sleep, I felt it again, the weight on my chest, the familiar paralysis creeping back in, a chilling reminder of my vulnerability. I tried to fight it, to push against the sensation, but it was no use. I was slipping back into that suffocating darkness, and I could feel the shadows gathering, the whispers rising once more, insistent and hungry. And as I lay there, once again trapped in the embrace of my worst fears, I realized that I was no longer just fighting for my freedom. I was battling for my very soul, caught in an endless cycle of terror that threatened to consume me whole, destined to relive the nightmare over and over, the shadows forever dancing at the edges of my mind, waiting for the moment I would falter and allow them in, dragging me into their cold, dark embrace. The silence of the room was almost deafening, the kind of quiet that presses in on you, heavy and suffocating. I had been drifting in and out of sleep for hours, my dreams a jumbled mess of shadows and fleeting images, but now I lay fully awake, my body rooted in place, caught in the all-too-familiar grip of sleep paralysis. I could feel the weight of my own limbs, as if they had been replaced with lead, rendering me utterly helpless. A deep sense of foreboding settled over me, wrapping around me like a vice. I attempted to move my fingers, to wiggle my toes, anything to break free from the icy grip that held me down, but it was useless. Panic began to claw its way up my throat, each heartbeat thundering in my ears, a drum roll for the dread that was about to unfold. As I lay there, my mind raced with memories of the countless times I had found myself in this exact position, knowing all too well the terror that often followed. The darkness in my room felt alive, swirling with intent, and I strained my eyes to see beyond the oppressive blackness that surrounded me. I could feel something watching, lurking just out of sight, and the realization sent a fresh wave of terror surging through me. I tried to call out, to scream, but the words felt lodged deep in my throat, as if they were stuck in a thick, viscous fog that refused to let them out. Then I heard it, a soft rustling sound, a whisper that seemed to slither around the edges of my consciousness, growing louder and more insistent. The air grew colder, and I could almost feel the chill wrapping around me, snaking into my bones. It was a sensation that sent chills racing down my spine, and I knew without a doubt that something was there, something dark and hungry, waiting for me to succumb to my fear. As the whispers swirled around me, I caught fragments of words that were barely audible, a chilling language that felt ancient and full of malice. It was a sound I couldn't understand, but I could feel its intent, a desire to invade, to consume. My breath quickened, and the shadows seemed to deepen, drawing closer, pressing in until I could almost feel their icy fingers grazing my skin. In the midst of the encroaching terror, I felt a flicker of resolve igniting within me, a stubborn refusal to be a victim yet again. I focused all my energy on my fingers, willing them to move, to break free from the immobilizing grip that held me captive. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I forced my pinky to twitch. The movement was so small, but it sent a spark of hope coursing through me. I pushed harder, willing my entire hand to follow, and finally, I felt my fingers curl into a fist. In the midst of the encroaching terror, I felt a flicker of resolve igniting within me, a stubborn refusal to be a victim yet again. I focused all my energy on my fingers, willing them to move, to break free from the immobilizing grip that held me captive. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I forced my pinky to twitch. The movement was so small, but it sent a spark of hope coursing through me. I pushed harder, willing my entire hand to follow, and finally, I felt my fingers curl into a fist. The entity lurking at the edge of my vision recoiled slightly, the darkness pulsing and shifting as if surprised by my sudden burst of resistance. The whispers faltered, retreating for just a heartbeat, and I seized the moment to gather my strength. "You won't take me," I forced out, my voice hoarse but determined. "I am not afraid of you." The figure hesitated, and I could feel its presence shift, a low rumble vibrating through the air. It was as if it were weighing my words, trying to decide whether to continue its advance or retreat into the shadows. The very air felt charged, electric, as I pushed harder against the weight that held me down. I struggled against the paralysis, fighting to reclaim my body, and finally, my legs obeyed. I kicked out, my foot striking against the mattress as I pushed myself to sit up. In that moment, the shadows swirled, angry and thrashing as if they were alive, the whispers morphing into a shriek of rage. I felt an icy gust of wind rush through the room, chilling me to the bone, and instinctively, I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to stave off the onslaught of terror that threatened to overwhelm me. But even as I did, I felt a sense of clarity wash over me. I had fought back once, and I could do it again. With a surge of adrenaline, I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and fumbled to turn on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness like a sword, and for a brief moment, the shadows recoiled, hissing and twisting away from the light. My heart raced, but I felt empowered now, the light a protective barrier against the malevolence that had haunted me. "Leave," I shouted, my voice strong and unwavering, filled with defiance. "You have no power here." I waved the flashlight around the room, illuminating every corner, forcing the shadows to retreat. The whispers grew quieter, fading into the background as the entity writhed in the light, its form twisting and distorting, becoming less defined with each passing second. The figure lunged, a dark mass darting toward me, but I stood my ground, pointing the light directly at it. "I said leave," I roared, my voice echoing in the now empty space, the sound a declaration of my determination. The entity shrieked, a sound that pierced the air, echoing off the walls, but I felt the weight of its presence lessen, the shadows beginning to evaporate like mist in the morning sun. With each flick of the flashlight, the darkness retreated, and I felt the paralysis that had gripped me for so long finally dissipate. My limbs grew lighter, the lead weight lifted, and I was finally free to move. I took a step forward, the beam of light steady in my hand, and I pursued the retreating shadows until they faded completely, leaving nothing but the lingering chill in the air. As I stood in the silence of my room, panting and trembling from the exertion, I realized the whispers had ceased, replaced by the gentle hum of the world outside. I was alone again, truly alone, but the darkness had been banished, at least for now. The shadows would return, that much I knew, drawn by the scent of fear, but I had faced them down and emerged victorious. I sat on the edge of my bed, my heart still racing, but a sense of peace washed over me. I had reclaimed my space, my power. I was no longer just a passive observer in my own nightmares. I was the one who would confront them head on. I woke in the dead of night, the darkness so thick it felt like a heavy blanket, smothering me. My eyes shot open, but I quickly realized I couldn't move. My body was locked in place, as if weighed down by an unseen force. Panic surged through me, a wave of dread that crashed against my chest. I was familiar with this feeling, sleep paralysis, but familiarity offered no comfort as I lay there, unable to scream or cry out, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The stillness of the room was punctuated only by the thudding of my heart, which echoed like a warning bell in the suffocating silence. The air around me felt charged, almost alive, as if it were filled with something sinister and lurking. I strained against the invisible bonds that held me, but it was as if my body had turned to stone. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be waiting in the shadows, what kind of nightmare was unfolding around me while I remained helpless. Every horror movie I had ever watched flooded back to me, the images of dark figures and malevolent presences seeping into my consciousness. The room felt foreign, a place that had once been my sanctuary, now twisted into a prison. Then I felt it, a cold, creeping sensation brushing against my cheek, like a breath of ice on my skin. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it away, telling myself it wasn't real, that I was safe in my own room. But when I opened them again, there it was, a shadow, darker than the surrounding night, lingering at the foot of my bed. I could barely make out its shape, but it seemed to pulsate, as if it were breathing, drawing in the very light that dared to touch it. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but the words lodged in my throat, trapped by the weight of fear. The figure seemed to shift closer, drawn by my terror, and the air thickened with an oppressive energy. I could feel the shadows growing, spreading like ink across the floor, swallowing the edges of my bed, inching closer and closer until I could almost feel the cold tendrils wrapping around my ankles. I focused all my energy on trying to move, to wrestle free from whatever held me captive, but my body betrayed me, unyielding and heavy. The darkness loomed larger, and I could hear a whispering, a low hiss that curled around my thoughts and tightened like a noose. It was a language I couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakably menacing, filled with promises of despair and terror. Each syllable twisted and turned in my mind, pulling me deeper into a vortex of fear. My heart raced as I felt the entity draw closer still, its presence heavy in the air, cold and suffocating. The whispers morphed into a low laughter, a chilling sound that echoed through my skull, resonating with every ounce of dread I felt. I could feel it looming over me, its form indistinct but full of malice, and I knew I was at its mercy. In that moment, I realized I was not just battling paralysis. I was contending with something ancient, a creature that thrived on the fear of its prey. I remembered snippets of what I had read about sleep paralysis, the tales of dark entities that preyed on the vulnerable, feeding off the very essence of terror. Desperation clawed at me, a primal instinct to survive that surged with every breath. With sheer force of will, I envisioned breaking free from the invisible bonds that held me. I concentrated on my fingers, willing them to twitch, to signal that I was alive and fighting back. And then, for a brief moment, I felt it, a flicker of movement, a twitch of my fingers. The rush of hope was intoxicating, and I clung to it fiercely, using it as fuel to push against the weight that pinned me down. With a burst of energy, I willed my entire body to move, to break free from the grip of the shadows. I felt the darkness recoil, a sudden release of pressure, and I seized the opportunity to roll over, flinging my legs over the side of the bed. I fell to the floor, gasping for air, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. The coolness of the wooden floor grounded me, reminding me that I was alive, that I had escaped, at least for the moment. But the room still felt thick with a foreboding presence, and I knew it wasn't over. The shadows danced along the walls, whispering promises of return, and I could feel their hunger lingering in the air. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline coursing through me, and I reached for my phone on the nightstand, its light cutting through the darkness like a beacon of safety. As I flicked on the flashlight, the beam sliced through the room, illuminating the familiar objects, the dresser, the closet, the bed. But the shadows seemed to shrink away from the light, hissing softly as if in protest. I took a deep breath, my heart still racing, and focused on the comforting sounds of the outside world. The distant hum of traffic, the occasional chirp of a cricket. I reminded myself that I was safe, that I could confront this. But as I turned to face the darkened corners of my room, my breath caught in my throat. The shadow at the foot of my bed had returned, a dark mass swirling and shifting in the beam of my flashlight. I took a step back, my pulse quickening again as the figure began to take shape, coalescing into something more defined, something that felt sentient, aware of me, and filled with an insatiable hunger. "Get away!" I shouted, my voice echoing in the silence, more defiant than I felt. I raised the flashlight higher, aiming the beam directly at the figure, but it merely absorbed the light, a swirling mass that didn't seem to be affected at all. The laughter returned, that low, guttural sound that resonated deep within me, and I felt my resolve begin to waver as fear clawed at the edges of my mind. I stumbled backward, the weight of terror settling heavily in my stomach, and I knew I needed to do something, anything, to fight back against the entity that threatened to pull me back into the depths of despair. I recalled the stories of those who had managed to break free, those who had learned to confront their fears, and I felt a spark of determination ignite within me. In that moment of clarity, I remembered the power of my voice. "You have no hold on me," I declared, forcing the words out despite the tremor in my voice. "I am not afraid of you." The figure paused, as if startled by my defiance. The laughter momentarily silenced, and I seized the opportunity. I began to chant, repeating those words like a mantra, feeling the strength of my conviction fueling me. "You have no hold on me. I am not afraid." With each repetition, I could feel the energy in the room shift. The shadows recoiled slightly, the figure wavering as if unsure of how to respond. I pressed on, louder this time, my voice rising above the oppressive silence. "You have no hold on me. I am not afraid." And then, just like that, it broke. The entity shrieked, a sound that echoed through the walls, a cacophony of rage and frustration. The shadows began to unravel, retreating from the light, dissolving like mist in the morning sun. I felt the weight lift, the oppressive darkness dissipating as the air grew warmer, lighter, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I continued to chant until the last remnants of darkness fled from my room, until the laughter was silenced, and I was left standing in the glow of my flashlight, heart racing but triumphant. The shadows that had once threatened to consume me had vanished, leaving behind only the faint echo of their presence. Breathing heavily, I sank to the floor, resting my back against the bed, feeling the cool wood beneath me grounding me in reality. The fear still lingered, a distant echo of what had just transpired, but I had confronted the darkness and emerged victorious, a small but significant victory in a battle that felt far from over. I realized then that I would need to remain vigilant, to learn to navigate the shadows that lurked in the corners of my mind, always waiting for a moment of weakness. As I sat there, catching my breath and trying to shake off the remnants of fear, I could still sense the lingering energy in the room, the atmosphere charged and electric, a reminder that the darkness was never truly gone. I would have to be ready to stand firm against it whenever it returned, because I knew it would, drawn by the fear that simmered just beneath the surface. But for tonight, I was safe. I allowed myself to breathe deeply, taking in the comforting sounds of the outside world, the reality of my surroundings anchoring me. I picked myself up, turning off the flashlight and allowing the darkness to settle once more, a darkness that felt less threatening now, a reminder of my own strength. And as I lay back down, finally allowing sleep to take me, I promised myself that I would confront whatever came next, that I would no longer be a prisoner to my fears, but a warrior in my own right, ready to face the shadows that would inevitably return. The clock ticked softly in the stillness of the room, each second dragging like a weight around my neck, the darkness pressing in around me as I lay beneath the covers, wrapped tightly in a cocoon of fabric that offered no real comfort. I had long grown accustomed to the feeling of dread that crept in during the night, a familiar companion that returned like an unwelcome guest, but tonight felt different. An electric tension filled the air, making my skin prickle, and I knew I wasn't alone. I rolled onto my side, trying to shake the feeling, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But as I lay there, eyes fixed on the shadows that danced in the corners of my room, I felt that familiar grip begin to close around me, tightening with a viciousness that left me breathless. My body became heavy, as if it were sinking into the mattress, and I realized with a jolt that I was caught in the web of sleep paralysis again. That cruel state where the mind is awake but the body remains dormant, a prisoner of its own flesh. My heart raced, pounding violently against my ribs, each thud echoing in my ears like a warning drum. I struggled to move, to scream, but my limbs refused to obey, heavy and unyielding, leaving me vulnerable and exposed. I could feel the shadows growing thicker, swirling and coiling like serpents ready to strike. Panic clawed at me, and I fought against the invisible chains that held me down, desperation surging through my veins as I became acutely aware of the coldness creeping into the room, an icy touch that sent shivers down my spine. Then came the whispers, a soft, insidious sound that slithered into my ears, echoing in the dark. They were indistinct at first, an unintelligible murmur that sent chills cascading over my skin, but gradually they sharpened into a chilling language that felt ancient and malevolent, the syllables curling around my thoughts like smoke. My breath quickened as I strained to understand, to make sense of the dark intent that laced their every word, but they slipped through my fingers like sand. I tried to shake my head, to block them out, but the whispers only grew louder, filling the room with a cacophony of sound that clawed at my sanity. My eyes darted around the room, seeking an escape, a shred of light to cling to, but all I could see was the oppressive darkness closing in, wrapping around me like a shroud. I could feel the presence lurking just beyond my sight, a shape that twisted and pulsed, drawing closer with each breath. The whispers intensified, a sinister chant that wrapped around me, drowning out my own thoughts. I could feel the weight of their gaze, an unseen force that bore down on me, probing and prying at the edges of my mind. In that moment, I knew that whatever lingered in the darkness was feeding off my fear, reveling in my paralysis. With each passing second, the pressure mounted, and I felt as if I were slipping away, my essence seeping into the shadows that thrummed with life. Just then, the figure shifted, coalescing into something more defined, a grotesque shape that hung in the air like smoke, swirling and twisting with a malevolence that made my skin crawl. Its eyes, if they could be called that, glimmered like coals, glowing with an insatiable hunger, and I felt a deep, instinctual terror wash over me. It loomed over me, an embodiment of everything I feared, and I realized in that moment that it had come for me. Desperation coursed through me, a primal urge to fight back, to reclaim my body from the clutches of this dark presence. I focused all my energy on my fingertips, willing them to twitch, to signal that I was alive, that I could break free. With every ounce of willpower, I fought against the immobilizing weight, the echoes of its whispers clawing at my mind, but it was no use. The entity was too powerful, too insistent. And then, just as I felt myself teetering on the brink of despair, a flicker of movement caught my eye, a glimmer of light at the edge of my vision. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to spark something within me. I remembered the stories I had read about confronting darkness, about using the light within to push back against the shadows. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I focused on that flicker, that sense of hope. "Leave me alone," I managed to croak, my voice barely a whisper, but the words held a power I hadn't anticipated. The figure hesitated, the whispers faltering for just a moment, and I seized that opportunity, pushing harder against the weight that pinned me down. "You have no power over me. I will not let you win." With that declaration, I felt a surge of energy course through me, as if the very act of speaking had ignited a fire within. My fingers twitched, then my hands, and suddenly I was breaking free. I rolled onto my side, the paralysis shattering as I gasped for breath, the air flooding back into my lungs. The figure recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame, and I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, heart racing as I stood up, facing the shadows. The darkness surged forward, but I was ready this time. I grabbed my phone from the bedside table, its screen glowing like a beacon, and I turned on the flashlight, illuminating the room with a harsh, bright light. The shadows shrank back, hissing and twisting, reluctant to be banished. My breath came in quick bursts, but I felt a newfound strength as I pointed the light toward the swirling mass that had tormented me. "Get out!" I shouted, my voice rising with confidence, resonating against the walls of my room. "You are not welcome here." The figure let out a screech, a cacophony of sound that echoed in my ears, and in that moment I saw it for what it truly was, a manifestation of my own fears, a creature born from the darkness that I had allowed to creep into my mind. I focused on that realization, wielding it like a weapon against the shadows. "You are nothing. You have no hold over me." With every word I spoke, I felt the oppressive energy begin to wane, the shadows retreating further into the corners of the room. I continued to shine the light on them, pushing back against the encroaching darkness, banishing it with the sheer force of my will. The whispers grew fainter, losing their grip on my mind, until they were nothing more than a distant echo. Finally, the room was still again, the shadows receding until they were mere wisps of smoke, dissipating into nothingness. I stood there, breathless and trembling, but victorious. I had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, reclaiming my space and my mind. The room felt different now, lighter somehow, as if I had banished not just the entity but also the weight of fear that had plagued me for so long. I sank back onto the bed, exhaustion washing over me as I grasped for the comfort of my sheets. The clock continued to tick, each second a reminder of the battle I had just fought. I lay there, my heart finally beginning to steady, the adrenaline slowly fading, but I knew this wouldn't be the end. The darkness would return. It always did, drawn by fear and doubt. But now I was ready. I had faced it and stood my ground, and that knowledge gave me strength. As I closed my eyes, I whispered a promise to myself. I would not let fear dictate my life. I would stand tall against the shadows, and when they came creeping back, I would face them head on, shining my light into the dark, refusing to be a prisoner of my own mind any longer. With that thought swirling in my head, I finally surrendered to sleep, determined to awaken stronger, a warrior against the night.